Welcome. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Sarah Schmidt. I'm just a volunteer. I'm not on the board. Anyway, I just wanted to welcome you tonight and start off the meeting by asking whether there have been any interesting sightings to report, as in probably bird sightings, although it could be some other kind of wildlife if you have such a thing. So has anybody seen anything of unusual interest?
We went to Lone Lake today and saw the pair of redheads that have been there for a while. Did not see the great egret that was been there last week.
If you don't know, redheads are a variety of diving duck that we don't very often see on Whidbey. So, and I don't know who first saw them, but they've been reported on eBird for a few days, so fun to see them. No egrets, no regrets. Anybody else? Well, are there any visitors that would like to introduce themselves to us, or just raise your hands and we'll say hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Oh, it's lovely to see new faces. Yes. Well, please come up to somebody with a name tag or somebody that is talking to like crazy to somebody else who probably is active here. Anyway, come up and say hi to one of us afterwards. It would be nice to start to get to know you. And I think with that, I will turn it over to our Vice President.
I'll talk from the big girl position. Okay. Well, it is great to see everybody. So glad you're all out here on this dark and stormy night. Just have a few announcements to go through with real quick. I want to remind you or tell you that we have an online class starting in January, a 4-week or a 4-session class called Go Fish. It's going to be taught by Connie Seidels, and this is a Zoom class. It's Tuesday evenings on the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th of January. And the topic, Go Fish, is the topic because fish have been a rich source of food for birds for millions of years, certainly long enough for avians to have evolved many styles of fishing. And in this series of 4 classes, Master Birder Constance Seidels will show you the strategies that different species of birds use to go fishing. They are by turns ingenious, persistent, patient, aggressive, cooperative, and altogether wondrous. And you can come to the sea, the rivers, the ponds, the lakes. We'll come with Connie as she tells us about the plungers and the pickers, the snatchers and the stalkers, the chasers and the scoopers. And of course, she will include her favorites, the pelicans. The cost of this series is $100, and the sessions are recorded, so if you can't make a particular session, you'll be given the recording information so you can watch them at your leisure. Connie has taught classes for us before. She's also been a presenter for us, and she's just marvelous. She's just very engaging, very entertaining, and very, very knowledgeable, so you'll really enjoy her classes. We are encouraging people to please register soon. We do have a minimum that we need to meet for this class to go. And we do not publish our newsletter in December, and we don't have a December member meeting, so we've got to remind you now and tell you now that this is a good time to act. But the first class starts January 7th, and all the registration information is on our website. And next up, I want to remind people that we have a field trip scheduled this Saturday at Fort Eby State Park, and our co-leaders, Martha and Steve Ellis, are here, and they will be leading you through the wonders of Fort Eby State Park, where you have the opportunity to see both forest birds and land birds and seabirds, and you may possibly see harlequin ducks, redneck grebes, Red Cross bills, and certainly lots of other good, wonderful things. And we would like you to register, please, on the website, and there still is space available. Usually they like to cap it at about 12 birders. So if you could register on the website, that would be great, but there is still space available. You are asked to meet at Libby Beach Park at 9 a.m., and that is at the end of Libby Road. So if you go down Libby Road and go too far, you end up in Admiralty Inlet. So, but meet there at 9, and you'll drive into the park from there, and cars that drive into the park will need a Discover Pass. So, oh, and then also, Sarah, you wanted to mention the January field trip.
So in January, on Saturday, January 26th, will be the annual loon extravaganza. So come to Deception Pass State Park and see hundreds and hundreds of red-throated loons coming in to feed in the waters of the outflowing current. It will start at 9 a.m. It will be co-led by myself and Steve Ellis, and there will be information in the January newsletter, and it is or soon will be on the website. But that's Saturday, January 25th, 9 a.m. at Deception Pass. It's always fun.
Okay, thank you. And Pam Notice is here this evening, and she wants to talk to us about our Wings Over Whidbey Festival, which is on the horizon for next May.
Hi there, I'm Pam, and I just want to put a word in for the Wings Over Whidbey Festival. I have in my lovely folder here sponsor sheets. If you know of anybody or any business that would be willing to sponsor the festival, that would be super. We don't have money in our coffers for the festival. We always have to get sponsors to make it happen. And this year it's going to be awesome. Sarah's going to be doing a presentation on bats. We have Caitlin Toreman, a falconer, doing a presentation. And if the ferry schedule works well, Discovery Wild Bird Rescue will be here. There's a low tide in the middle of the day, so I'm praying that they make it, because they had to cancel once when they did a presentation. Yes?
How much does a business need to get?
There's a 100 level, above 100, and then a 500 and above. Yeah, like a 250 or, yeah, I can't remember the, well, I have it on here. What am I doing? Oh, my senior moment. 500 and up, 150. Anyway, if you know of anybody, I have forms. I also want to put a pitch in. I need volunteers. Robin Llewellyn's not here. She's going to be gleaning volunteers to help with the displays. And then Linda Dwight's going to be gleaning volunteers to help with the welcome table. But we need setup and breakdown people. And last year, apparently, Steph Neese and her husband Paul did it all by themselves. The cleanup, I'm saying. Yeah. And I don't want that to happen. Thank you. You know, our backs can only take so much. So I'm just putting it out there. My email and telephone numbers on our website. So contact me if you know of any groups that could help us, or you know, any way to make this go well with a group effort. Did you say the date? Oh, May 17th. Thank you. You're helping me out so much. May 17th, PRI, 11 to 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Yeah, this is our third Wings Over Whidbey Festival that's coming up, and last year we had a great response from the public. We had a lot of attendance, you know, from the public, a lot of families and young kids, and we're hoping that this will continue to be an event where the public will come and bring their kids and stuff. And so any volunteering you can do to help make it happen, we would really appreciate. And I would like to introduce Jackie Lassiter, who is the chair of our Conservation Cabinet. She would like to share a few words with you. Would you like to?
There's no sound.
Well, it says the host muted you. The host muted everybody, I guess.
Hi, my name is
I
Jackie
know, but they're
Lassiter,
talking, so.
and I am the new conservation chair for Whidbey Audubon.
And I'm here tonight, it's sort of a plea. We're looking for new members of the conservation. Oh,
The fuck?
sorry. See, my first faux pas. All right, so we're looking for new members of the Conservation Committee. We'd really like to reinvigorate the Conservation Committee back to the level of environmental advocacy that has been well known for. So I'm asking for volunteer members to join the committee. I have sort of an info sheet with email contact information back at the front desk. It would probably be 3 hours a week commitment. And part of this is with the new administration in the White House, and I don't want to get political here, but I do know that there's really going to be a new set of challenges to the environmental regulations that we already have in place. And so the thought being that working locally, advocating locally for the environment is probably going to be the best solution for us in the short term to protect the important bird areas that we have on Whidbey Island, and more specifically Deer Lagoon, Crockett Lake, Swan Lake, and areas that where we could have an impact by advocating for birds and the habitats where they flourish. And so I'm going to ask if anyone's interested in joining the Conservation Committee, if they'll just send me an email and let me know that they might be interested. And I'll get back to you and we'll reconvene a meeting and sort of work out the details of what might work best for everyone and set priorities for what we want to work on this year. Also, I want to alert you to the website. There's 2 new things on the website within the last couple of days. One is a call to action. Island County has some 3 open houses on Whidbey Island coming up in December, and this is an opportunity to give input to our important bird areas on Whidbey Island. In addition, just within the last couple of days, Island County has sent out a survey, and it's a survey about not only county parks, conservation areas, land trusts, etc., all of the natural resources on Whidbey Island to give input into the comp plan and the development that's going to be happening within the next 6 months. So take a look at the website, see if there's something that interests you, take the survey, and if you can, please participate in one of the open houses. In particular, with Deer Lagoon, there's a lot of advocacy about changing its name to Deer Lagoon Preserve, to changing its category to being a conservation versus a public park, and to limit the kinds of activity that occurs at Deer Lagoon. So anyway, it's a really good opportunity to, and a pretty easy opportunity to speak out and to have an impact on what happens with our important bird areas on Whidbey Island and beyond. Thank you very much. A very nice turnout tonight.
And just one more announcement before we get to our program, and that is about one of the more important things that Whidbey Audubon does every year, and that's our annual Christmas bird count that is coming up, and Govinda is going to share some information about that. Do you want the hand mic or the recording? I'll use this one, it'll make me look taller.
Hi everyone, my name is Govinda. I organize the South Whidbey Christmas Bird Count, and I have this map that I colored 14 years ago. This is our 14th year, and maybe you live within this circle and you have a bathroom that you can open up. we like to start early, drink lots of coffee, and we need to use the loo. So that's part of it. We're also looking for team leaders. We have a couple of sections open. We will take a few beginning and intermediate birders. You can contact me from the Whidbey Audubon website. But also we have food. So at the end of our birding day, which is at 4 p.m., we'll meet at the Trinity Lutheran Church in Freeland. And we need volunteers to make some food. I know somebody out there can make a mean chocolate chip cookie, maybe, or pumpkin bread. And Nicoli is the one who is organizing the food, and you can contact her. I'm not sure if she's on the Audubon website, but you can contact me and I can forward it to her. So looking for food, people to make food, some birders, intermediate, but definitely some expert birders who would be interested in leading a section. And then to put in a plug for Steve, Ellis is now organizing the North Whidbey count. Do you want to mention something about that? Yep, so the North End is on December 14th, so a couple of good leaders for his count. My count down on the South End is on the 28th, and then just because there's so many volunteers out here so are eager, I want to put in a plug for Pilchuck Audubon Society. You know, we're all in these 15-mile circles, and we're this island, so they all kind of come together. Pilchuck has a little sliver of possession point. So I told Brian that I would put in the plug for if anybody wants to count on the 14th down in possession, they can go to the Pilchuck Audubon website, and they have a registration form online. Okay, well, thanks.
I'm curious how many people have seen or heard a corvid in the last few days? You know, jay, crow, raven. Corvids are very common birds, and throughout history, they have been alongside of people, and they're found on nearly every continent, and they've influenced our art and our literature. And there's a lot of times there's this love-hate relationship too that can go on with corvids. But how do people affect corvids? Our speaker tonight is Dr. Kaeli Swift, who loved wildlife since she was very small, especially birds, and what she really liked was behavior and cognition. She was interested in that component. She discovered that crows and other corvids were a perfect marriage of these two things. And so she went on to the University of Washington, and she earned her PhD in avian behavioral ecology, where she studied American crows, and with a special emphasis on behaviors around death. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the U of W, where her work has taken her to the Mariana Island of Tinian, where she has been for the past 3 years, and at this moment is on a jet flying back. Now, I got in touch with Kaeli about a year ago, and we tried to work out a time where she could share her knowledge. And we finally decided, November 14th is the perfect date. And then she was going to fly back to the States on the 15th. She never thought about the time difference. So about a couple weeks ago, she emailed me. She's going, oh my God. She goes, I'm going to be on the jet on the 14th. But she said she's very creative and resourceful, and she said, I can pre-record the session. And so that is what she did. And she's on this little island of Tinian, where I don't think they have a huge, strong internet connection. But we have a recording, and Tom has been amazing getting this to work. she offered to answer any questions since she won't be live at the end. She offered to answer any questions that people may have. People on Zoom can just put them in the chat, and then we can get the questions. And then if people have a question here, I can write them down, and then I'll email them to her, and we'll put the recording up on the website, and we'll put the questions down below with the answers. And I apologize for the way this came out, but it's what is. So Kaeli regularly gives public talks to audiences ranging from elementary students to career academics. She has video, audio, and print reports of her research that have been featured by National Geographic, PBS, the New York Times, the Atlantic, Ologies podcast, Science Friday, and many others. And so tonight she'll share her knowledge about corvids and their relationship to human in Something to Crow About. Yeah. Oh, and there are two little glitches that we were not, towards the end of the presentation, that we just were not able to get fixed. And there's just, Tom's going to fast forward through the slides so that the talking stays the same.
Hi everyone, Dr. Kaeli Swift here, and I am so thrilled to be joining you tonight to talk about crows all the way from the middle of the Western Pacific on Tinian, where I live, which funnily enough usually means that I'm joining people from the future, because I am about 18 hours ahead of Seattle time. But this is the very rare and unusual case where I'm joining you from the past, as this is obviously a pre-recorded talk. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to your leadership for being so flexible and gracious with me, allowing me to do this, particularly Kathy and Tom, for really working hard to put this together despite the couple of curveballs that I've thrown them. So I hope that you guys enjoy this presentation. I hope you learn a lot about crows, and I absolutely hope that you send me your emails of those crow stories and those crow questions, or whatever corvid has captured your heart at the moment that I know a lot of you probably came tonight hoping to ask. So know that I'm looking forward to those emails, and I hope I get them. So with that, let's get started. So I find one of the best places to start often when we're talking about crows is establishing what exactly the difference between a crow and a raven is. Obviously, if you are a big-time birder, this is old news to you, but for a lot of folks who maybe are just kind of dabbling, maybe they're not super hardcore birders, or maybe they know that these birds are different, but they're not great at telling them apart yet, this is just like a very foundational place to start this presentation. So crows and ravens, different birds. And in fact, one interesting thing is there's no it gets a little dicey because yes, when we're talking about our local birds in Washington, when we use the word crow or we use the word raven, we're describing very different species of animal. But in general, there's actually no biological rule for what makes something either a raven or a crow. So if you were to discover a new species of bird and you were like, okay, am I gonna call this a crow or raven? That is actually a subjective choice. Usually we base it on size, but there's really no real difference in the general terms. But of course, we know, living in Washington, that if you see a blackbird, it is different. And so the key ways that we can distinguish common ravens from American crows, which are the two species that you would be encountering in Washington. Some of you might also be familiar with the northwestern crow, but that was actually collapsed into the American crow a few years ago. So we only have just American crows and ravens at this time in Washington. But the biggest differences are size. Ravens are about 2.5 times the size of a crow. Habitat, we generally associate ravens with more wildland habitat and the ability to live further away from people relative to American crows. American crows are typically always found very close to human settlements. Ravens can do really well in cities. There's a big breeding population in LA and San Francisco, but they're also happy to be well away from people. So those are some good kind of general rules of thumb to help to identify these different birds. There are also, of course, some distinct physical differences that can be helpful when you're observing these birds in the field, but are particularly helpful when you're seeing birds in photographs. And I actually find it's often more challenging to distinguish these birds when you're looking at them in a photograph, because you don't have all of that other kind of auditory or behavioral context that can tip you off to one or the other. So if you're seeing a still frame of these birds, one of the first places to look is the throat. So ravens have these really distinctive, long, kind of lancetated throat feathers called hackle feathers. They can puff them out and articulate them in all different kinds of ways. They use that for visual signaling, while American crows, on the other hand, have these very smooth throat feathers. Likewise, ravens can also articulate their little horns, the feathers above their eyes. So they just have a lot more sort of dexterity when it comes to the feathers around their face that make them much more expressive than American crows do. In flight, the best way to distinguish these two birds, with the exception of right now actually, is the tail. So ravens have this really distinctive diamond or wedge-shaped tail, versus American crows generally have a more squared or rounded tail shape. Now, the reason I caveated that with this time of year is that we are in the post-breeding season. We've got a few birds. It's kind of the end of this process, usually a bigger problem in September, October, but we still have a few birds that might be in the process of molting. And when that happens and those new tail feathers start to come in, you can get crows with like perfectly raven tails. So don't let those guys fool you in the fall. So I don't so much anymore, but one of the things I used to do was play this little game called Crow or No, as just a way to test people's ability to distinguish these birds. And more importantly, it wasn't really about quizzing them and seeing who knows more. It was an opportunity to show people, one, that this is actually can be very challenging, and two, there might be a lot more kinds of crows and ravens than you have experienced or expected going into this game. So I want to play a little version of this for you guys now, sort of test your ability. I know this is an Audubon group, so I have high expectations for your performance. No, I'm just kidding. You can perform however you like. This is a judgment-free zone. I hope you have fun. So I'm going to show you 4 pictures. All you have to do is decide if the bird in the photo has the word crow in its recognized common name or not. But a little heads up, I can source these photos from anywhere in the world. So that's the challenge I'm giving you. All right, starting with photo number 1, take a good look. Maybe you took notes from earlier in the talk and make your decision. Crow, no. Okay, moving on. Photo 2. Give this one a good gander. What do you think? A little different looking than the one before, maybe, maybe not. All right, number 3. Bird in flight. Okay, and finally, bird number 4. There we go. All right, so you ready to find out how you did? Let's get to it. Number 1 was no crow. That was a common raven. We have some of those really basic diagnostic features, those hackle feathers that you can see protruding from the throat. You can see a little bit of that articulation on the eyebrow. It's also just a much bigger, heavier bodied bird. So very classic raven there. All right, bird number 2, looking back, what do you think it was? It is juvenile rook, not a crow. Juvenile rooks are the meanest bird that I can throw at you in this game because they look so much like crows when they're in this phase before they molt out those rictal bristles that are above their bill and get that really distinctive chalky appearance that we think of when we think of rooks. But at this phase in their life, they have that typical corvid mustache, and so they make very, very tricky contestants for crow or no. But the way that you can distinguish them is they have a much sharper point to the bill because they are a probing corvid. They get most of their food from the ground, so they have these very sharp bills. All right, picture number 3, black noddy. So not even close to a corvid, definitely not a crow. Giveaway here, those really tapered wing feathers, very seabird-like, and then of course that really funky tail. And last but not least, we have our little brown friend, this hand over here. Was this crow? No, what'd you think? This was, and you can't see it because I'm there, but it's an American crow. This was actually a very special crow that I want to talk a little bit more about because some of you may be thinking like, okay, is that a crow? I've never seen a crow like that. And some of you may be very familiar with birds that look like this. So this is Ferdinand, and I gave her that name based on her location. And she is what I have designated as caramel crows, though their scientific term would be a brown type crow. And they are just a typical American crow. Well, I shouldn't say typical. They are a technical American crow, just like any other American crow that you might see on Whidbey Island or anywhere else in Seattle. But they have this special mutation that gives them these color aberrations. And actually, this particular type of aberration is one of the most common that you might encounter. Albinism is probably a much more familiar term, but this is actually a more common phenomenon that you would see among birds in nature than albinism is. And Ferdinand, when she was alive, was a bit of a celebrity. This bird really stood out, and humans are just naturally drawn to animals that look unique. We generally have preferences among species groups for individuals that stand out. And so people really took notice of her. I wrote a couple blogs. I would talk about her on Twitter. And so people had a really good time sort of, I never revealed her precise location, but when people thought that they encountered her, would report her on social media. And it was this kind of fun thing where there was this very big sort of group cohesion just around this uniquely colored crow. And what's really interesting about that is that it's not that interesting. People just love crows. It's actually not that unusual to find huge social momentum behind crows. And the question is, why is that? What is this place that crows hold in our lives that's so different from most other kinds of wildlife? And you can really see evidence for this in how frequently crows come up in the topics of media headlines. So here's an example from a couple years ago of a foul-mouthed crow that escaped and wound up at an elementary school in Oregon, much to the delight of all the kids there who learned a couple new four-letter words that day. There's this really famous story in certain parts of the internet about somebody who claims to have befriended crows to the point that they would act as their bodyguard and protect them from maybe some nefarious characters in their neighborhood. This is just an example. You can see this post got over 200,000 likes, and it's just kind of a strange looking crow that sort of set the internet off, wondering why it looked like this. It actually wasn't doctored in any way. It was just kind of a slightly emaciated type of Asian crow species, so it had a very different look than our typical American crows. But these just kind of illustrate all of the different ways that we see these animals pop up across social media, more news media, like all of these different sources. We're just fascinated with these birds in a way that we're not fascinated with chickadees. I love chickadees, right? But we just don't have this same kind of broad cultural connection with them. Oh, here was another story about a gentleman, this was a few years ago, who claimed to get art from the crows. They would take, oh, again, you can't see it. Let's see if I can get rid of myself. They would take the pull cans off of the pull tabs off pop cans and thread them onto, it looks like Doug fir needles, and left them on his porch. And he claimed that this was a form of art that they were giving him as a gesture of gratitude because he would feed them. So again, just a variety of examples of the ways that crows really tend to capture our imagination. So the question that we're going to tackle for the rest of today is why? What is it about crows that really captivates us? And I think the best place to start is in just some really basic aspects of their natural history that sort of make it, sets the stage for this really unique relationship. So one of the features is that they live a long time. So for those first couple of years, things are a little dicey, but if they can make it past that juvenile gauntlet period to about year 3 or 4, their survivorship increases quite a lot and is very, very high from one year to the next. So it's not unusual to find a crow living more than 14 or at least 14 years old. When you take that age component and put it in complement with the fact that they're often territorial, meaning that a male and female pair will establish a territory and they spend a lot of their time there. Then you get individual birds that are interacting with people for potentially very long periods of time. They're also, when we think about their diet, they're a generalist species, so they rely on us, they rely on our food, they're happy to associate with us. They are a synanthrope, so they're literally an animal that doesn't live very far away from human settlements. And then they have these very kind of familiar features, things that it does not take a background in ornithology or animal behavior to pick up on as something we recognize. And I think their family dynamics are a really good example of that. They do mate for life, so they have these really strong pair bonds that they pretty regularly strengthen. Like you can see the pair in this photo here. Touching each other is a way to strengthen that bond. Meanwhile, their kid is up here in the corner just reminding them, hey, I'm hungry, please feed me, right? And those are just very recognizable interactions for us. So you kind of put all of that together. You have this animal that's very visible, conspicuous. It's getting into our backyards. It's hanging around our house. They're doing it for maybe more than a decade, and it's the same birds the whole time. You have the perfect foundation for kind of creature watching, right? That most people aren't going to get from any other kinds of interactions with other backyard birds or other kinds of backyard wildlife. So if we want to then dive into this question a little bit more and pick out some of the other features that really make these compelling birds, I think one of the best places to start is just their conspicuousness, their visibility. So for a lot of people, some of the barriers to bird watching is that binoculars can be expensive, access to places to see birds, rare birds, is difficult. It's certainly hard if you're looking for little warblers at the top of Douglas fir trees. That's just kind of a hard thing for some people to be able to do with no other introduction. So if that's not a world that they're coming from, it can be sort of hard to bridge that gap of like, how do I use these things and look for this little bird that's like moving all around the treetops? But like looking outside of your office or your apartment to a crow, that's easy. They're just right there. You don't need anything to see these birds, and they'll really call your attention. And one of the ways they really call our attention in the Seattle area is through what's called communal roosting. So despite the fact that crows have these individual territories that they maintain most of the year and spend a lot of their time on, at night, in the fall and winter, they'll leave those individual territories to sleep in what are basically giant slumber parties. So if you've been in the Seattle area, in the evening, shortly before dusk, you may have seen the kind of rivers of crows. And there are certainly going to be smaller versions of these that are happening on Whidbey, but they're not going to be to the same scale that we see in Seattle. So if you haven't been there, I want to give you a little peek at kind of what this nightly movement looks like. So suffice it to say, it is a lot of birds. On average, about 15,000 birds attend the roost. There's actually 2 roosts in Seattle. There's one up north in Bothell and then one down south in Renton. It's about 15,000 each, though there's fluctuations every year. But roost size can vary quite a bit. It can be just a few birds. Historically, in the United States, the biggest roost was in Danville, Illinois, and that one had over 300,000 crows. So this is a perfectly normal part of their behavior. Now, there's a couple reasons why they engage in communal roosting. One is it's a really successful anti-predator strategy. You can imagine if you are a pair of crows sleeping alone on a tree branch in your territory and an owl comes in, you stand a much higher chance of getting depredated than if you are, one of 15,000. There's probably some really strong social benefits to engaging in this behavior. Potentially opportunities for courting, for example, or information exchange, all kinds of things. And despite how conspicuous this behavior is, there's actually still so much we don't understand about what crows are doing in these roosts. And one of the, I would say the biggest remaining questions is before they go to the roost, they often engage in what are called pre-roost aggregations somewhere else. In my experience, they love like construction sites for these places. They don't really seem to be eating, but they're very, very chatty. And so there's just a lot of aspects of this behavior that are still open to scientific exploration. So in addition to things like roosting, which may not be something that we necessarily relate to as people, though I think the idea of safety in numbers is something that appeals to us, they also exhibit some other behaviors that are much more straightforward and clear to us. And I think one of the best examples of this is their funeral behaviors. So when I use that word funeral, what I am describing is this broadly observed phenomenon where when a crow dies, once its body is discovered by other crows, that discovering individual will alarm call and it will recruit other birds, other crows to the scene. And they'll gather, sometimes they're really noisy during these gatherings, sometimes they're not, but it's just kind of this referencing this idea that when they find a dead member of their own species, there's this kind of ritualistic gathering. And that was actually what I focused on as a graduate student when I was attending the University of Washington, getting my master's and then my PhD, was this question of like, this is a really interesting behavior that we've really only scratched the surface of, but there's a lot of questions still to be asked here. And one of the main ones was just in quantifying how exactly do they respond? What is the most typical version of this behavior? Because there was no question when I started the work I was doing that this was a real phenomenon. I certainly did not contribute that to science. People have known about this for a very, very long time, this idea that these birds seem to pay very close attention to their dead. My task was in further sort of quantifying and describing what does that behavior typically look like. From there, I wanted to ask what the adaptive value of this behavior is, right? I am an ethologist, I'm somebody who studies animal behavior, and I, like, everyone trained in kind of the Western scientific approach, am asking this question from a perspective of the evolutionary history of this behavior and what might produce this kind of behavior. And so while there are potentially a lot of ways that we could answer that question, or other sort of things that we might be interested in when asking, like, why do crows respond, I start with that really base question about what is the adaptive response. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Next, I wanted to ask what kinds of issues of context might they be paying attention to? Do they respond to all crows equally? Or are there questions about context that might influence their response? And then lastly, we looked at what neurological mechanisms might be mediating this external behavior that I had been evaluating. So the first question was, how and why do they respond? And one of the things I wanted to test was this question of, could this behavior have its roots in danger learning and avoidance? Would the adaptive value of paying attention to your dead, could it be that it helps guide your own safety in a dangerous environment moving forward? So the way that we tested that question is I would identify a pair of crows, I would start feeding them, and then we would have our funeral day where we'd have this mass person or a mass person come out holding a dead crow. We also tested a variety of other stimuli, but this is the one that makes the best picture. And we would record how the crows responded. And then in the days that followed, we would keep feeding them to see, is there any change in their willingness to come down to this pile of food that in the day or days before had been associated with this really scary experience? And, or if they see this person again, who they didn't see injure this crow, but certainly they were holding it very visibly, how are they going to react to that person? And we found that in the case of both of those questions, the answer was they're clearly paying attention to danger. So we did see a difference in how quickly they were willing to come to the food pile after these events, and we definitely saw that they maintained that facial recognition and that grudge for the entire 6 weeks of the duration of the experiment in a lot of cases. So they are taking in information about danger through these experiences of these funeral experiences. Now, does that mean that they couldn't also be experiencing an emotional response? No, those things are not mutually exclusive, but this was the component of this question that I chose to focus on because it's a much simpler thing to test than, trying to evaluate how a crow feels, which is not something that we are still particularly good at doing with animals. If you want to learn more about this study, you can find PDFs of all of my articles on my blog, which I will link to at the end of the talk. Next up, I asked this question of what are they attentive to? So if this is about danger learning, if you remember back earlier in the talk, I mentioned how baby crows don't live, their survivorship isn't as high as adult crows, right? They're naive, things happen. And so they encounter dead juvenile crows a lot more frequently than they encounter dead adult crows. So if this behavior is really motivated by danger learning, we might hypothesize that they would have a more low-key reaction to seeing a baby crow, a dead baby crow, because they can get killed by all kinds of stuff that a more knowledgeable adult crow would know to avoid, versus if they see an adult. So we compared that, we showed them one of each, and we found that particularly in the summertime, when their responses are more constrained because they got a lot on their plate, they're taking care of babies, they are much, much more responsive to adults than they are to juveniles. So they are clearly attentive to issues of context, such as the age of the body at the time that it died. And then lastly, we wanted to try and get at this idea of, could there be sort of an emotional context that isn't necessarily showing up in their external behaviors where they're just gathering and alarm calling? It's the same alarm call that they produce when they see other kinds of predators. How could we get at this question though? The way that we approached it is with this really unique non-lethal brain imaging technique where we can take a crow, bring it into the lab, give it an injection that helps trace its brain activity. It's the same one that you would get if you were having something imaged with a CT scanner. And then we can anesthetize the crow so it's asleep, put it in the brain scanner, and retroactively look at what its brain was doing when it was awake. So we can look at what parts of the brain were being activated when the crow who was awake 20 minutes ago was looking at a dead crow or an empty room or a familiar face, whatever it is. And we wanted to use that as a way to maybe try and tap into, are there parts of the brain that we associate with strong emotional intelligence maybe being activated during this experience? So here's what that process looks like. You can see the bird. This is kind of the bird's eye view here, the picture on the left of what it would maybe be looking out at. You can see somebody holding a dead crow. And so the question is, what is going on in its mind during this experience? From this point, we anesthetize the bird so that we can put it in that PET scanner. The reason that we use PET scanners and not MRI machines, which I think are a little more familiar for people, is that you have to be awake in an MRI machine, and there's just no way you could train a wild crow to tolerate this really confined environment. So this is a much less stressful experience for the crow because they're just knocked out for the whole thing. After they come out of the scanner, wake up, and then they get released. All in all, this is a pretty unusual way. I mean, most of the time when you do any kind of neurological stuff on wildlife, it is invasive, either because you're implanting something, because you have to euthanize them at the end. So we were really proud of this work as being one of the very rare instances where we're able to sort of look inside the mind of an animal without actually having to do this really invasive procedure. What we found from doing these studies was that, to our surprise, genuinely, we didn't see activation in the area of the brain that's typically associated with emotion, which is the amygdala. We saw most of the action taking place in the the analog to the prefrontal cortex, which, when you put that into the context of the rest of our work, made a lot of sense, because clearly these birds are really thinking through these experiences, internalizing this information, and potentially using it for decision making. So all made sense. Now, in addition to all of the ways that we find community and similarity with crows, one of the other reasons that I think they're very at the forefront of our sort of cultural interest in them is that they also really irritate us. They can really get under our skin. They're very present in our lives, and there's lots of ways they can do this. So a really common one is we know that crows recognize faces. We knew that before I started in on my funeral work, though that's another piece of evidence of a way that crows may, or another context in which crows may learn and remember your face. But the studies by John Marsliff, shortly before my time, really clearly established that crows can learn our faces, particularly in negative contexts. And this is something that has very real world consequences. Here's a video of somebody illustrating crows following them and harassing them. Here's somebody else who posted to a forum that they ticked off crows and now they won't stop bothering them. They're asking for help. But of course, there's other ways that crows might irritate us. A really common one for bird watchers is, of course, crows leaving things, particularly dead things, in bird baths, which is an unfortunate common habit of theirs. And then things like pecking holes in roofs or maybe picking at cars, general sort of like property damage. And so these things, you know, I think one of the reasons that I like to bring this up is obviously my goal is to get people as excited about crows as I am, because I do think that they pose this really incredible opportunity for forming intimate relationships with wildlife because of the things that I mentioned at the top of the talk with them just living for such a long time, carrying these really interesting lives, right? I think it's just an amazing opportunity to really know an animal on an individual level. But I also don't want to ignore the fact that crows often come into conflict with people, and we have to be able to sort of meet people where they're at and address these things rather than pretending like they're not real. So if anybody came here with some crow qualms that they need some help addressing, please do feel free to email me. One of the other ways that they can be seasonally irritating is in this behavior. I don't know if this is going to be a familiar experience to those of you here. It's certainly a pretty familiar experience on the streets of Seattle. You're walking down the sidewalk. It's like a beautiful June, maybe early July day, and like whoosh, you get the swoop. And it's spooky, right? And this can really, you know, this is not helping their reputation, especially if people are genuinely like minding their own business and don't know what is causing this reaction. But of course, the answer isn't that these are just like malicious birds that like to harass people. It's that they're actually very good parents. And what is happening at this time of year, kind of like midsummer, is that crow babies are starting to leave the nest, and they're very vulnerable in this period of time. Crows very often leave the nest before they're completely flighted, and so they have this period of time where they're on the ground, they're running around, they don't know, you know, their head from a hole in the ground, so they're just making all kinds of mistakes, and mom and dad are just stressed to the bones, right? Just trying to keep these kids alive. And they see you're this big, powerful animal walking towards their kid. And, you know, like genuinely, what choice do they have but to try and guide you away from their kids? And that's what they're doing in those moments. Now, for a lot of folks, it's really hard to assess that's what's going on because a lot of people don't know how to recognize baby crows. I don't know if any of you have encountered, you know, when you tell people you watch and love birds, you often become like the source of anything bird related that any person who encounters you have. They'll ask you these questions. And one of the ones that I certainly get a lot is like, why don't I ever see baby pigeons? Where do pigeons come from? I've never seen a baby one. And part of the answer to that question is that by the time you're seeing them out in the environment, they're a lot bigger than you might be expecting, generally speaking, and looking a lot more adult-like. But of course, there are some key ways to tell baby crows from adults. You can look for that pink gape. So baby birds can open their bills extra wide. It's not completely sealed right here, and often the interior of their mouth will be this very vibrant color that helps just signal to the parents like, this is where you put the food. I'm really hungry, feed me. Some of the other features to look for is eye color. So baby crows have blue eyes for most of summer. Their general plumage is going to be a little bit different looking than the adults. In general, juvenile birds, they're growing their feathers a lot faster than adults do when they go through their annual molts. And so as a result, the feathers are generally of lower quality. They don't have that really high gloss iridescence that we see on adult crows. They're just kind of a little dingier looking. Proportions are kind of a little funky. Tails are shorter. So those are some other features. And then of course, they just scream. That's another thing. You could actually listen for them being babies and maybe figure it out quicker than looking for them because they will tell on themselves pretty quickly as soon as they see mom and dad in the picture. Though so that's true for slightly older baby crows, that you may see them looking a little bit different, especially if they've left the nest a little too prematurely, like you can see on this bird in the left. That juvenile probably could have stood another few days in the nest, but mom and dad will definitely continue to take care of it. So in general, I always tell people just Leave them alone unless they're like under immediate attack from a pet or they're in the middle of the street. Like, you know, there's a lot of crows, let mom and dad do their best. But one of the other features you can look for to identify a more new baby crow is that they'll lack the melanization in their softer tissues, well, their beak and their legs, I should say. So you can see this bird here has slight pink hue to the bill and to the legs, and that will completely melanize pretty quickly, and then they'll be looking more like a typical crow. So here you can see examples of these two juveniles. They still have those gapes that we talked about earlier, but the bill and the legs are black. Now, all that said, for all of the ways that crows maybe get under our skin a little bit, actually probably the number one reason that we like them, that we pay attention to them, is that they're funny. They're charismatic, they do all these kinds of amusing behaviors, and we just get a kick out of it. And the thing about people is we like getting a kick out of things. We pay attention to those things because it's a good feeling. And crows are just make really good fodder for this kind of behavior because since they are smart, since they live in these social groups, they find themselves with a lot more downtime than many other types of animals and other birds have. And because they have all that freedom and all that free time, they play games. And they play games as adults, which is pretty rare in the animal world. There are actually 7 different kinds of play that we've documented in the corvids, things like flight play, bath play, sliding, which is what you're seeing in this GIF here, these hooded crows, which are native to many parts of Europe, well known for loving the snow play. Common ravens also really love the snow play. Object play, maybe you'll see 2 juveniles playing tug of war with another. Vocal play, that's what they're doing at like 5 in the morning. The baby crows, like right outside your window, and they're just like practicing all their little sounds, which, you know, when you put it in that context, it's sweet, right? It's like kind of a cute alarm clock. Hanging, that's a really weird one where they just like grab a branch and they hang upside down. It looks like something terrible has happened to them, but they're fine. They are literally hanging out. And then cache play, where they might hide an inedible object or a different type of object that they will maybe retrieve later. So this quality that they have of just being really charismatic and amusing is something that I think people really, really latch onto. The last major theme that I want to touch on is just how dang smart they are, because we see this sort of playing out in a variety of other aspects, but it all kind of traces back to this idea that these are really uniquely intelligent birds, much, much more on par with primates than we ever could have dreamed of. And by we, I mean Western scientists, you know, back in the early 1900s. We just were not giving birds that much credit. There's a reason that that term bird brain was around. And it was because we got it really wrong. Bird brains are very different than mammalian brains, and we in our hubris just kind of assumed that meant that they were more primitive and less capable of doing some of these really complex things. But in fact, they possess the same kinds of cognitive toolkit features as primates. So the main things in those toolkits that we look for, and the reason that we have this structure, is because the whole question of animal intelligence obviously is a very difficult one to pursue, right? Because as a human being, we're always limited in our understanding of the world by our own sort of lens, which gets influenced by all different kinds of things. So like, how are we to judge the intelligence of another animal? And the best way that we have to approach this question is by having identified features of behavior or ability that we can really clearly trace back to higher order executive function, rather than things like instinct or trial and error, some of the more simplistic things. And the reason that that distinction is important is because animals are capable of really complex achievements through very simplistic mechanisms. So a really good example of that is like ants building a bridge, right? That's really impressive. The idea that they can build a bridge to get over an obstacle is pretty amazing. But it's not because they understand physics. They didn't go to like physics class. And they're all executing a very, very tiny part of this chain of events that culminates in something that's very complex. But they don't understand it from that complex perspective. So when we're busting out this cognitive toolkit, what we're trying to ask is this an example of an animal achieving a complex result through a complex process? So the different features that make up this cognitive toolkit are things like causal reasoning, so their ability to understand cause and effect, imagination. This is one that's very hard for us to imagine because imagination is such a key daily part of our experience that it's weird to envision a world where that wouldn't be, but it's actually very difficult for your brain to imagine things that aren't happening. Honestly, I wish it was a little more difficult for my brain than it is. I'd probably do it too much, but like, that's just credit to me for being amazing, because actually that's a huge feat of accomplishment for a brain. The third feature is flexibility, so being able to take in new information and adjust rather than just reacting in kind of this instinctive, hardwired way. And then the last one is called prospection, which just means mental time travel. So I want to give you some examples of some of the studies we've done to evaluate a few of these components and how we've been able to use that to illustrate that these birds are much, much more ape-like than really most other birds, maybe with the exception of parrots, certainly with the exceptions of parrots, relative to anybody else in the bird world. So let's talk first about imagination. This is one of my favorite studies because it was pretty simplistic in its approach. Essentially, they were taking advantage of a behavioral trait that they already knew about, which is that ravens are caching species, meaning they hide food for later. And one of the challenges of being a caching species, if you are a social animal, is the propensity for other members of your social group to steal from you. So ravens are very sensitive to this, and when they think they're being watched, they behave differently than when they think they're alone. So this study was taking advantage of that fact to try and ferret out whether or not ravens could imagine a competitor that they couldn't actually see. So the way that they did that is they had these captive ravens, and they had an aviary with a partition down the middle, and in that partition they drilled a little peephole. And so for the first part of the study, it was just about giving birds experience with the setup. They would put one of the ravens on one side, that they'd have the handler go to the other side. The handler would call to them. Raven would hop up to the wall, look through that peephole, see the handler over there, yada, 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 get the experience. So from there, the question is, all right, so now we're gonna put the raven back in its little aviary. We're gonna give it some food, but on the other side, we're gonna play raven calls. And the question is, how are they going to act? Are they going to act as if they're being watched, even though they can't actually see any other competitors around them? Or are they going to act as if they are alone? And what they found is that if the peephole was closed, the partition was closed, even if they could hear a raven on the other side, they acted as if they were alone. But if the peephole was open, they acted as if they could be being watched, which was a reflection, by, according to these authors, that these birds had the ability to imagine a competitor that they couldn't actually see based on their own previous experience of what it meant to be able to look through one of these peepholes. So like I said, I just thought this was a really brilliant way to ask what's a very complicated question of, how do you ask if an animal is envisioning something? And this is just a really good example of a very clever way that we've been able to demonstrate that with these birds. Next up, I want to talk about causal reasoning. Now, if you've ever come across an article that's mentioning how smart crows and ravens are, oh, they're as smart as an 8-year-old kid, or any kind of topic on intelligence, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but they're generally not talking about American crows. Most of the work on intelligence that's done in crows is on this species called the New Caledonian crow. And New Caledonian crows live on an island, surprise, surprise, called New Caledonia, and they're very special because they're one of the only animals that make tools. There's one other corvid that probably did in the wild, the Hawaiian crow or alala, but unfortunately Hawaiian crows have been extinct in the wild for many decades now, so we don't have any evidence that they did, but based on the very small captive population that still exists, it seems likely. But that's a really unusual thing. Even using tools is very rare in the animal world, but making them, taking an object and manipulating it, less than 10 fingers, the number of species that do that. So New Caledonian crows, very, very smart, and they've made really good models for asking these complicated questions about different ways that intelligence manifests in these birds. So I want to play this video for you. It's a really great demonstration of one of the ways that we've tested for causal reasoning in the New Caledonian crow.
All right, can I stay in here?
Absolutely, you can sit and watch.
Right.
And we'll see what happens.
Come on then, send in your mastermind because it's going to need that.
Alex studies wild birds, which he releases after 3 months of research. This one is nicknamed 007, and it's about to attempt what Alex believes is one of the most complex tests of the animal mind ever constructed. The bird is familiar with the individual objects, but this is the first time he's seen them arranged like this. 8 separate stages that must be completed in a specific order if the puzzle is to be solved. And if the bird succeeds, it'll be a world first. He takes time to have a look and then starts with the short stick. Stage 1. He finds it's too short to reach the food. He then sets off to get the first stone. But he drops it. And another. He seems to be stuck. But then, something seems to click. He deploys the first stone. And then another. Got it. The 8th and final stage. Success. 8 individual stages of one complex puzzle completed. That was remarkable. I've never, ever seen anything like it. Of all of the bird behavior that I've seen, nothing matches that. I can hardly believe it. I'm still just running that sequence through my mind. It happened really quickly. But the immediate question is, of course, how on earth did that crow do that?
And the answer is that because they devote a huge volume of their brain to what is their prefrontal cortex, the same area of the brain that we use for really difficult executive function, problem solving things. So it's just, there's no other animal that we've been able to show can put together an 8-step sequential problem like that. It's just really incredible. And we have every right to be very excited about what these birds get up to, because it's, unmatched in a lot of ways in the rest of the animal world.
All right, can I start?
And as we kind of wrap things up in terms of, how crows have reached this status in our cultural zeitgeist of being these really uniquely, positioned birds in terms of our affection for them, or just the amount of time we spend thinking about them. And I think that you can't finish that conversation without touching on the fact that, as bird watchers, we're very used to that being a fairly one-sided relationship, right? Like you go out and you look at your chickadees or your warblers or your woodpeckers, and you've got the binoculars and they're kind of going about their own business. But with crows, it's different. It is a two-way street for sure. They're really paying attention to us, and not just from, potentially perceiving us as predators, as something to just kind of keep it at arm's length and keep it a distance, but it's something that they could potentially exploit. And there are lots of ways that we see the consequences of that, in terms of our day-to-day interactions with us. And of course, one of the most famous examples is, and we've touched on this a few times in the talk, is their ability to recognize our faces. And John Marsliff, who's pictured here, was able to demonstrate that in his study from a couple decades ago now, looking at crows. And you may have actually just seen, they reran an article just a few weeks ago. They did another series of tests, and so there was a bunch of headlines about how for some of these birds, less of them now, but for some of these birds, they have carried on this tradition for, it's been 17 years since this initial study. So it's a really, really incredible feat, and just really demonstrates the level of attentiveness that they are giving to us in our environment. But of course, it's not always just a negative context that they learn our faces. They also learn our faces in positive context. So this is one of my favorite stories of a gentleman outside of the Seattle area who had a routine of feeding crows. He had a platform outside in his backyard, and he would feed the crows very regularly. And one day he went out there, he put all of his treats out. The crows were waiting and excited for him. And he said, every day I bring you all of this stuff and you never bring me anything. And feeling a little crappy that day. Goes inside, and then, he would always come back out, check the platform, make sure all the food was gone. Good point of practice, keep the rats and stuff away. And he saw that, yes, all of the food was gone, but on the platform was one of those little, starchy Valentine hearts, the little candy hearts that said love on it. And he thought, uh-oh, what is going on? What does this mean? Is this real? Have I lost it? And so he reached out to John, and together they sort of embarked on this effort to try and eliminate some of the hypotheses that might explain this behavior. And what they came up with is, we don't know. I mean, it was definitely real. This really happened to this guy. And we have since gotten so many stories from people who tell us about their experience of getting gifts from crows. Now, I'm not here to tell you if it's actually a gesture of gratitude, not because I disbelieve that that's possible, but just because I don't know. I don't know why they do it. It could be that they find things and they like to carry them around, and then when food becomes available, it's, becomes inconvenient to keep carrying those objects around, so they leave them there and they take the food instead. Or maybe they really are trying to create this sort of positive feedback with us where they leave things, we love it, we give them better or more food, and so they're like, oh, they really like that. They've trained us basically to engage in this relationship because they really benefit from it. So we still, like I said, we still don't know the specific answer to that question, but for now, I don't really care. For now, the point is that if you feed crows, you might get a present, which is pretty awesome. Now, it's no guarantee. I will tell you, I spent a lot of my years, we don't have crows here on Tinian, but I spent a lot of my years in Seattle feeding crows. Never got a gift. Don't take it personally, but the chance is there, and that's pretty special. And I think in this world, maybe this moment in particular, I think any opportunity we can give people to feel connected and close to the natural world is a good thing. Lastly, just because I can't help myself, I think this is so interesting because the whole facial recognition thing I think is really cool, but it's also been around for a long time. People are very familiar with this idea that crows can recognize our faces. But where do we go from there? And the question is, or I should say the answer is voice. So this seems to be the next frontier. We know that they can learn our faces, but what about our voices? And one of my favorite researchers on this topic is Sabrina Schultz, and she looks at large-billed crows, which are primarily Asian variety of crow. And we knew from other studies that crows can definitely recognize the voices of people they're familiar with, in contrast to the voices of strangers. But her study looked at the ability of wild crows to distinguish between human languages. So her study species are Japanese natives. So she would test their response to playback of either a Japanese speaker or a Dutch speaker to see, is there any difference? And there was. They could recognize they were much more keyed in on the foreigner, the Dutch speaker, than they were when they heard the more typical language of their area. We don't know exactly the answer to that question. Maybe it is informed by the fact that tourists would maybe be more likely to give them food, or it's just something unusual in their environment, so they're going to key in on it more, but very, very interesting behavior. And then of course, it's not just that crows recognize our voices, but they also are very good at mimicking them. So I will leave you with this short video of Mischief, the white-necked raven, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he was for a long time a great ambassador for all of corvid land and a really good example of the linguistic abilities of corvids.
So ravens are excellent at mimicking sounds they hear. Mischief, can you say hello? Hello. Good bird. He does all sorts of voices. He said hi. Hi. Good job. And sometimes he hears people who have a cold. Good job, Mischief. Can you say hello? No. Hello. He's all excited. But hi. Hi. Good boy. Hello. Hi. Hi. Hello. Hi. Hi. This isn't working out, Daniel. Good bird.
So very, very good at imitating people, though, you know, classic corvid, like they're not just going to do what you want all the time. That's kind of the whole thing. They do what we like sometimes, but they got to have that kind of edge of mischievousness in them, or, you know, it just wouldn't be the same. All right, with that, I just want to thank you all so much for showing up tonight to learn about crows and ravens. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any stories you want to share, questions that you wanted to ask, I really hope that me not being here tonight doesn't preclude you from getting those to me. So I have dropped some ways to contact me. Definitely the most reliable way is to just email me, but you can also find me on social media. I am most active on TikTok and Instagram. You can find me at the Corvid Research handle. And then of course, if your appetite for corvid knowledge has not been filled yet, please feel free to check out my blog, corvidresearch.blog. I have hundreds of articles answering general knowledge questions, unpacking scientific articles. I have book recommendations, all kinds of things on there. So once again, thank you so much for coming tonight, and I really look forward to hearing your questions and stories. Have a great weekend.